Hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. We're happy to have you all with us today for this discussion of a new publication titled Building the Belt and Road Initiative in the Arab World, China's Middle East Math. And we're excited to have the book's author, Jonathan Fulton, with us. Jonathan is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. His teaching and research interests focus on China's relations with the Gulf Arab monarchies, international relations of the Gulf, and international relations of East Asia. I should add that Jonathan's publishers are offering our audience a generous discount this morning if you were to purchase the book today, and we'll share that discount code with you all in the chat. Moderating the conversation is my colleague Robert Mogielnicki. He is a senior resident scholar at AGSI. He created and leads the China Gulf Initiative and teaches a graduate level seminar on China, Middle East, and North Africa relations as an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. And with that, Robert, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Raymond. And thanks, Jonathan, for joining us today. I mean, you've been someone I've relied on for years to help me make sense of what China is up to in the Middle East. And you'll be very well known to many people on this webinar. And I think for those who are just meeting you, they're in for a real treat. I think the foundation of this webinar is Jonathan's new book. He's published this book we have here. It was mentioned in the intro. We do have a hard copy. It's still
Oh, nice.
support publications here. Building the Belt and Road Initiative in the Arab World, China's Middle East Math. Now, it's an excellent contribution to what is really a fast-growing body of literature. And this work, in contrast to a lot of the other works out there, uses a very neat and concise cooperation framework, the 1+2+3 cooperation framework, as its analytical guide or structure. I'll let Jonathan kind of dig more into that as part of his remarks. But I think it's very effectively done, and it helps both those of us who've been looking at China-Middle East relations for some time, and I think newcomers really get up to speed very quickly and get a good grasp of the where, the what, and the why of what China is up to in the Middle East. So before we get into the nitty-gritty here, I wanted to just ask Jonathan to give us your elevator pitch for why you continue to look at China, Middle East, and especially China Gulf relations. I mean, we've got a lot of other regional events, global events to focus on that could keep us distracted. But what motivates you to continue looking at this topic? Why does it matter for the region, and where does this book fit into that?
Well, first, thanks for the invitation. Always enjoy doing stuff with you and the team, Rob, at the Arab Gulf States Institute. It's a real pleasure. It's funny, asking an academic to give an elevator pitch is funny, because usually by the time the elevator door opens, we haven't made it past the first sentence. But I mean, why I watch it and why I think it's important is this is a deeply misunderstood geopolitical event. China's become a pretty significant actor in the Middle East over the past decade, and it's something new under the sun. And because it's something new, there's just a lot of misunderstanding of what it's about. And that's kind of why I use this framework for the book. Looking at a decade, the framework you mentioned, the 1+2+3, was rolled out in 2014. I stopped looking at it for the end of 2024. A decade of engagement, you see patterns of cooperation, patterns of engagement that really give you a sense of what's going on. And I think it's important because typically what happens, and I can see the elevator is already going up to the next floor again, and everybody's laughing onto their office. But what will happen is there's some big event like Xi Jinping goes to Riyadh, or there's a Saudi Iran rapprochement, and everybody looks at this in isolation and says, "Oh my goodness, China's stepping into this region, and this is something really consequential." In isolation, it looks like that. If you take the longer view, what you see is like I said, a pretty consistent pattern of engagement that shows what it is China's trying to do, how Gulf countries or Middle Eastern countries are taking advantage of that, or using it for their own ambitions, and what it means for other regional actors like the US or the Europeans or India or whoever.
Okay, that's great. I mean, we made it in plenty of time. We've got long elevator rides here in Washington, so I was perfectly suited. Let's bear down a bit on 1+2+3. What is it in its essence, and how did you incorporate it throughout this book, or how do you continue to, more importantly, how do you continue to use it to understand the evolving nature of China-Gulf relations in particular? I know this book was about the broader Middle East and North Africa, but today we'll spend most of our time talking about the Gulf region because that is the focus of our work here at the Institute.
Okay, so what it is not particularly well understood for starters. 1+2+3 cooperation framework was rolled out in 2014, like I said. There is an ongoing multilateral forum, the China Arab States Cooperation Forum. It's how China and the Arab League basically coordinate their policy agenda. They've been doing this since, I think, 2002. And every 2 years, they have a forum. It typically alternates between an Arab capital city and Beijing. And what they'll do at these forums is they'll kind of lay out the priorities for the next 2 years. In 2014, it's held in Beijing. 2014 is a very important point. I'll just back it up a bit here. This was only a few months after the Belt and Road Initiative was rolled out. And the Belt and Road Initiative was initially described as the Silk Road Economic Belt, this kind of Eurasian connectivity project that would link China with Central Asia, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which was a kind of a China Southeast Asia connectivity project. And then a few months later, the Arab League states show up in China for this forum, and he rolls out this 1+2+3 and says this framework is how we want to deepen ties between China and the Arab world. And it's important that it's Arab because the other Middle Eastern countries, Israel, Iran, and Turkey, aren't involved, although you'll see similar types of engagement and cooperation. So the clumsy title is consistent for those of us who've been watching China for quite a while. There's often these kind of numbered priorities or numbered policies that don't make a whole lot of sense to the uninitiated, but you get used to it when you're a China watcher. Each of these numbers represents a type of like a basket of like a sector. One is traditional hydrocarbons. So one is called energy at the core. That's oil and gas trade. Pretty straightforward. Two is called the two wings. This is oil and gas, or sorry, trade and investment and infrastructure construction, which again, pretty straightforward. This is how we typically think of China in the Middle East. And three is called the three breakthroughs, which is renewable energy, nuclear energy, and space satellite. And you'll notice these are all very much economically focused priorities. Basically China's saying we're coming into the region much like we have. We're going to focus on economic engagement. We're going to coordinate with Arab countries' development agendas, whether it's the vision documents, the Saudi vision, the new Kuwait vision, all of these different development agendas, and find ways to get our state-owned enterprises, which already are pretty deeply embedded in the Arab world, to focus on these particular industries or sectors. And what you've seen is over the past decade, you've seen a lot of a lot of these take off or continue to take off. Oil and gas, of course, is really the baseline of everything we're looking at. Infrastructure construction, Chinese companies have just made literal fortunes across the Arab world. The third sector, the third basket, the three breakthroughs, renewable, nuclear, and space satellite is kind of interesting. Renewable, of course, has become a major growth area for Chinese companies in the Arab world. Nuclear hasn't really had the impact they were hoping for, and you can see why that's a very sensitive type of engagement that really brushes up against kind of existing patterns of ex-regional cooperation between Gulf countries and the US. And space satellites, well, I think the idea here was that Beidou space satellite was going to compete with, kind of the GPS system, and that just hasn't been the case. Although a lot of countries have been using Beidou for agriculture and for, different things. And that too looks like, I imagine if they were rolling this out today, a different 1+2+3, you probably wouldn't see space satellites as much as you'd see like EVs, for example. But that's basically what it is. And why it means anything in the Gulf? Well, of course, the Gulf countries have just been very enthusiastic in engaging with this because it presents great opportunities for them to increase their tech, to increase their infrastructure, to get investment and trade with rising power.
Yeah, there are a lot of overlaps across those different areas, the one, the two, the threes. We're going to dig into those a bit more just a moment. But before we do, I wanted to press you on the question of Chinese motivations here. And you do get into this in your book, but how can we, if at all, differentiate between using this framework as a way for analysts and observers for us to understand activities and engagements that have been ongoing and are likely to continue, kind of as a neat way to think about them analytically and as an analytical framework, as opposed to what's actually motivating Chinese actors, be they government actors or business actors. And you do talk about this, and I think this is a kind of interesting tension. I'm wondering how you reconcile this. I mean, how do we use this framework? Does it work in both directions? I think those are two parts of a triangle. There's a third triangle of how it's understood. This framework is understood in the Middle East region. But I'm wondering, what are the Chinese motivations there? And is it very clear to you that this framework is driving is a driving force in Beijing for how Chinese companies engage across the region?
So first, I mean, think of this like the Belt and Road, where a lot of the Belt and Road cooperation priorities were things that China was already doing all over the world. And this kind of presented a framework to say, this is how we're doing it. It created opportunities for Chinese municipalities or state-owned enterprises or lending institutions. If it comes with this, stamp of approval as it's a BRI project, it really kind of it lubricates a lot of things, right? So it's the same thing. If you're an SOE, a Chinese SOE working in the Gulf or working in the Arab world, and you can say, oh, look, this is not just us making a buck. This is us promoting China's, agenda here through this framework that Xi Jinping rolled out in a speech, in which was included in the China Arab Policy Paper in 2016. It creates a lot of momentum for these companies. I mean, really, how do you think about it? You should think of it as naked self-interest. Chinese companies are thinking, these are markets where we can make a tremendous amount of money, especially in the Gulf. They're places where we can develop long-term economic relationships. And are they always, win-win, as the Chinese, government would put it? Well, of course not. There's a bit of win-win. There's no win-win equally. It's been very interesting for me just over the past few years. You often hear, thinking of the trade investment side of things, one thing that keeps getting rolled out is China is a top 5 trade partner with every country in the Arab world, and particularly in the Gulf. And yeah, China often is the number 1 trading partner of Saudi, of the UAE, of whoever. Um, that's not always necessarily a good thing. Like being number 1 in Egypt, for example. We're getting a bit away from the Gulf, but I think the last stats I saw were bilateral trade for 2023, in which they had reached a peak. It's something like $13 billion worth of trade. Of that, and it kept getting touted by the Egyptian government. Look, China's our top trade partner. China's doing so much with us in the realm of trade. What that, real terms, China exported about $12 billion worth of everything to Egypt, and Egypt exported about $1 billion worth of energy products to China. So is this, a balanced economic relationship? Not at all, right? I think the Egyptians look at it and think, well, China's already announced 2030 is going to be its peak energy imports. By 2060, they don't want to be, using much of the stuff at all. And that's the only thing they buy from us. Meanwhile, we're buying everything under the sun from China, and that's bad for local manufacturing. It's bad for local companies. So, you see in different elements of this, they talk a lot about contracting, which is great, but it's Arab money going into Chinese companies. Now they're helping these companies build stuff they need, but it's really supporting these Chinese SOEs to a much greater extent than it's helping the others. So I think you see that across everywhere, and of course they'll line it up with the development agendas, and this will make it a lot easier for the Gulf countries or Arab countries in general to make it palatable. And it's often Chinese companies get the contracts because they do it good, they do it on time, they do it relatively cheap. But it isn't really kind of this neutral relationship the way you rightly put in the question.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of the point you made in the book about different vulnerabilities associated with the forms of engagement that run along this cooperation pattern. And you mentioned the Egypt case study, but I'll give one from the Gulf. I mean, if you look at Oman's trade with China, it is dominated, at least Omani exports are dominated by hydrocarbon exports. And not only that, most of Oman exports in terms of its crude oil goes to China every month. And I think that to go back to the point of vulnerabilities, if you break down some of these relationships along the lines that you have in the book, you do see a number of, potential vulnerabilities, asymmetries emerging. Are there any others that come to mind, especially in Gulf countries, that came up in your research and that you cover in your book or otherwise?
Well, I think the Emiratis have done a pretty good job of mitigating that pretty thin line between sensitivity and vulnerability.
Hmm.
You know, they're actually they're the major Arab economy that actually consistently exports more to China than they buy from it. So they handle it relatively well. I think mostly that's just a result of a degree of comfort or status in how they operate economically around the world. They don't need, necessarily what China has. They're happy to take it, but they've got other options. I think the Saudis in particular are kind of a little closer to Oman than they are to the Emirates. Obviously, they're putting a tremendous amount of energy into trying to build this post-hydrocarbon economy, and there's a lot of geopolitical tensions that have to get resolved to contribute to that. And then that's where you kind of see the political side of what China does in the region. How does it support or not support what regional actors want or need? Um, for the Saudis, it's kind of the same dynamic as what I described with Egypt. They really sell a lot of one thing and they buy a lot of everything, and it's going to be pretty hard to get um, something else that China wants from Saudi up to the same level. Right now, they typically sell. It's very imbalanced. Saudi exports to China are much much greater than their imports, but you can see a point not too far off, and that's going to flip.
Hmm. Interesting. Let me also bring the Global Development Initiative into the conversation. We talked a bit earlier in this conversation about the BRI and the emergence of this cooperation pattern around the same time as the emergence of the BRI. Um, the Global Development Initiative is a more recent initiative, and wondering kind of what your thoughts are around this initiative, where, if at all, it fits into this equation.
So the Global Development Initiative, it's interesting. There's four of these global initiatives. They don't really get talked about a whole lot yet. The Global Development Initiative was the first, I think, in 21, the Global Security Initiative in 22, the Global Civilization Initiative, and then 2 weeks ago they rolled out the Global Governance Initiative. And these are all mostly normative, right? Whether the focus is security or development or governance or whatever. What it is China basically saying um, there's a international norms of global governance are mostly Western derived and Western centric, based on a liberal model of how the world's supposed to work. And obviously, in a lot of the world, which is not liberal or Western, there's a deep frustration with this. And China has used its kind of self-declaration as the world's biggest developing country to say, look, we've got an outsized voice that can represent the global South. And what we can do is articulate some of the frustration or dissatisfaction with the way these international norms work and promote alternatives. And that's what these are. Now, whether or not China gets to self-nominate itself as the leader of the global South is an excellent question. Prime Minister Modi, when India hosted the G20 a couple of years ago, very modestly put India forward and said maybe we could be the leader of the global South. And you can see a lot of different voices. And what happens basically is a lot of countries are saying, yes, we agree with what China's saying, that there has to be reform in global governance. But why in the world would we want China's model to replace it? Because you can see this model where the state is the referent object of the security, which is a very state-centered model that doesn't necessarily take people's concerns into consideration. It's a very heavy-handed surveillance, technological, um, difficult for a lot of folks. So there's kind of deep frustration. At the same time, when you ask people in the Gulf, if you ask people in the Arab world about the Global Development Initiative, most people will say, "What in the world is that? I've never heard of it." This really seems to be something that the Chinese government is promoting. Mostly, um, it seems the biggest audience for it is their own domestic audience to say to people in China, "Hey, look, we are competing with the West. And look, we rolled out the Global Development Initiative, and 80 odd countries have signed on from Africa and Asia and the Middle East. This is proof that they see us as a very important partner. But the reality is, almost nobody knows anything about it. The Global Security Initiative. Then Foreign Minister Qin Gang, who only held the job for about 200 days before he was disappeared. When he was the guy who hosted the Saudis and the Iranians to announce the rapprochement, and that was part of his rollout, was to say, look, this is part of the Global Security Initiative. This shows like this works. And the Saudis and the Iranians agreed, but behind the scenes, everybody said, what's the Global Security Initiative? Like, this doesn't make any sense to us. So, I mean, this development initiative model, you can see the norms are mostly like, let every state focus on its own path towards development. You don't have to follow Western norms or preferences. You don't have to worry about pressures of liberalization, democratization, changes to your media laws, recognition of different minority groups or whatever. If you need the money, we're there behind our lending institutions. And we're not going to force you into any kind of uncomfortable corners the way the West does. So it's kind of part of what they've been saying for quite a while, just with a new name.
Great. I mean, if you look across the three different components of this 1+2+3, I mean, some of it makes a lot of sense. You've got the energy trade being a core, especially for Gulf countries. That makes a lot of sense. Focus on infrastructure, trade, and investment. Again, these are areas that a lot of us have been looking at for some time. There are trackers out there, and then there's that third tier, the three breakthroughs, which I think is is very, very relevant, timely, especially for those following geopolitics. And I do want to dig deeper into that with you, but when you looked across those three different dimensions and really started to unpack them, did anything surprise you? I know you said a lot of what you found in the book confirmed your beliefs, but I mean, what did you find that surprised you?
Yeah, so what I was hoping, when I started doing the research for this, by being in the Gulf as long as I have, I've lived in Abu Dhabi since 2006, and being, the Gulf GCC guy in my research, I thought maybe I'm missing a bigger story that hasn't really been talked about. I thought I'd see, there's a country that's doing more. There's a type of industry that nobody's really been watching, and that just hasn't been the case. I mean, the Gulf is the dominant region or sub-region in this, and it shouldn't really surprise us because the Gulf is the group of countries that have the wealth to handle the contracting, to work on the investment stuff, that can pay for the big renewable projects, and also the political and military stability or security that makes it easy to operate in. When we saw the Bashar al-Assad government collapse in December, and there's a lot of kind of breathless analysis that China's going to go into Syria and go in with jump in with both feet and take a leading role in reconstruction. And what you've seen, the reality is Chinese SOEs have been very reluctant to go into, high risk environments for any number of reasons. But the biggest is just, they're primarily commercial entities. They're not in it, for the good of human kindness or whatever. They want to make money, and they could say, look, we could go into Syria or Libya or Yemen, very unstable environments where we don't really have a lot of operational history and don't really know how the place works, and we don't have deep networks of political leaders or whatever to make a little money. Or we could stay in Dubai or in Riyadh and make a lot of money and enjoy Friday brunches and a nice comfortable lifestyle. So there wasn't much that surprised me or kind of caught me off guard, really. I guess the depth of what China's been doing with Morocco was unexpected. What they've been doing with Iraq was bigger than maybe what I anticipated. In terms of the three breakthroughs, I've been watching nuclear for a while because in 2017, there'd been this buildup where the Saudis had said this was very important to them. And they were looking at using nuclear energy for any number of things, like using it for desalination, that they're going to get commercial reactors, and they're going to open up the tenders for, I think there were five companies from 5 different countries that look like they were leading the charge. And it's kind of a flirtation for quite a while that, China might be the country to get it. So you can see from 2017 really up until around COVID, there's kind of this will they or won't they dynamic. And then it just kind of fizzled. And you don't really hear about China in the nuclear space quite so much the way you did, especially in Saudi, where, that being bundled in with AI as part of the long hoped for security agreement with the US on, that included Israel, uh, really kind of took it off the table for Saudi. And you can see countries like Korea that have been doing a great job and have really planted their stakes pretty deeply, and Russia and Egypt is also doing very well. There hasn't been much space for China in that. Um, the renewable stuff, though, I mean, this is something people aren't really watching as much as they should. I get in the States why that might be the case because your current administration seems pretty hostile towards the industry. But I tell you, it's very, very, very significant in this part of the world where you have, not just the Gulf countries that are looking to, use less of their main product by using renewable energy, but all countries that have their zero carbon projects, countries in the rest of the Arab world that are looking for cheaper alternatives because they aren't energy rich. And Chinese companies really are best in class in a lot of this stuff, and they're going in a huge way. I wrote a column for the Arab Gulf Business Insider last month about China-Oman renewable cooperation, and I had no idea how much was happening. But you see this in a very, 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 very big way. So I think that's the thing that really, if anything, surprised me was just the depth of China's engagement in that sector.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your book, if I'm remembering correctly, the some of the figures around renewable supply chains and some of the imports into the Gulf, whether it's kind of renewable technology or equipment, and the concentration of goods coming from Chinese suppliers for some countries is incredibly high in certain acute instances. So. It's a really interesting space to watch. Yeah, I think I mean on the three breakthrough dimension, you do also mention in the book that there are sensitive areas. I mean, we were kind of going back and forth between Chinese business actors weighing engagement in conflict zones, and I think and I'd agree with you. There's not a lot of evidence to support that Chinese actors have jumped into these conflict-fraught zones. But there are some difficulties to navigate even in the Gulf landscape where we have stable economies, stable governments, even nice brunches. What are some of those sensitivities that you see emerging, specifically related to those three breakthroughs? We talked a little bit about nuclear, talked about renewables, but I mean also in the broader technology space that I think we can get into today too, in our conversation. Like, where are you seeing those sensitivities emerging most clearly and acutely?
Yeah, I mean the tech, right? Because this isn't just about economic, this is about standard setting and norm setting for the future. And this is a space where um, China and the US, I tend to be a, not a little, I tend to be quite dismissive when people talk about China-US competition in the Middle East, because I don't think it's a real competition. It's a competition the way me versus LeBron James is a competition playing one-on-one basketball. China does some things very well. The US remains the dominant actor in most areas. Um, and that's just a fact, in this region. Um, think of China competing with Turkey or the UK or the EU, and that makes sense. But China-US competition is a little overwrought, I would say, at this point. But on the tech side, it's a little different because China has good, cheap tech that they're willing to, pursue market share, perhaps more than profit. If we can get more companies using our tech stack, the cables and the hardware and the apps and the software and all this stuff, and getting them into our kind of network across the region, then we're going to be the ones that are setting the stage for the future. And that was that was a very contentious issue here in the Gulf. Now, I remember the day that it was announced that the G42 here in the UAE was going with Microsoft. I was actually at a meeting in the U.S. Embassy that morning, and of course, being at the U.S. Embassy, we all had to surrender our cell phones and mobile devices at the security. So we're in this meeting with no idea what's happening outside the door, and we spent about 2 hours talking about this very issue, like what's happening in the AI space. Is China really going to dominate in AI in the Gulf, in the UAE? And then we kind of left the meeting all a little concerned, and then we all looked at our phones and went, "Oh, I guess that's solved." Um, but not really. I mean, in the case of G42, it is right. G42 said we're not going to work with Huawei. I'm currently in Abu Dhabi, just about 2 kilometers from where I'm sitting is the Mohammed bin Zayed AI University. That's in the broader Masdar City complex, which has a lot of Chinese tech companies operating. And nothing, as far as I know, nothing nefarious. They're commercial companies that are helping the UAE develop their agenda. They have a very ambitious goal for using tech, for using digital payments, e-commerce, all of this stuff, and they're really good at it. I think what G42 has said is we're going to silo off anything that touches into that kind of critical infrastructure that could compromise our cooperation with the US, and that kind of set the parameters. But I don't think it means that, checkmate, US wins, China loses. And you can see across the region, Chinese companies are still making pretty significant inroads. In the Gulf, where countries can afford the best in class, they're going to go to Microsoft and they're going to say, look, it's worth it for us. We'll pay the premium to sit at that table and to be seen in that way. But I remember my first reaction, literally, to hearing about the G42 thing was, where are these Chinese companies going? Where's Huawei going? And I thought, oh, North Africa, right? Like this part of the Arab world that has these very intense development needs, that needs the telecoms, that needs this digital transformation, and they can't afford, the best in class. They're looking for the best price point. And I think what you'll see is that'll be a very competitive region in the tech space, because what Chinese companies offer is appealing, and they already have a pretty solid infrastructure in place to engage with those countries. So I think the Gulf is mostly solved in this space. I would look to how it plays out in other Arab countries.
Sure. I mean, when you say solve, though, we wouldn't, I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily mean that Chinese technology multinationals have departed the Gulf. I mean, if you look across
Oh
and do
no.
a good survey, you see quite a lot of activity going on. I wonder if, is it fair to say maybe that, especially since Donald Trump has been elected, the amount of high profile announcements and deals, especially with the kind of big, we think of national champions in the Gulf, the big name brands, there has and in cooperation agreements with Chinese companies, there's not a lot of examples of that happening, especially over the past few months. It seems to me like the high profile, high visibility dimension of technology cooperation between Gulf states and China has really kind of died down, and there's a lid on that for the time being. But under the surface, there's still a lot of activity going on in the tech space. Is that a fair? I mean, that's the sense I get of things. Is that a fair assumption?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's made it a more challenging environment for Chinese companies to operate in,
Yes.
because they have to, it's been very politicized. And I don't think that's a mischaracterization. I think this has been tied definitely to security and political cooperation. Um, I know that's the Chinese interpretation, but that's a limitation. China isn't willing to do the types of things, or it's not able to do the types of things the U.S. can. And for countries that want that type of American engagement, you have to make those choices. What you'll see instead is Chinese companies do still do a lot of business here. Um, what you'll see is a major announcement. Um, with something from a US company. And then you hear about, a Chinese um, self-driving taxi car that's being modeled in Dubai, or air taxis, which are being, doing trial runs in Abu Dhabi or whatever. So there is still a lot of space. The tech ambition here is pretty significant, and there's a lot of room for other countries and other companies to engage. So yeah, it's not like China's got its tail between its legs and it's leaving. It's just on that really, top level stuff. When you see, American and Emirati or American and Saudi elites meeting, that comes with a suite of tech companies that's going to also make some pretty significant deals out of this. And Chinese companies will also be doing it, but they'll be doing it, at a rung slightly lower, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're all expecting that big a big objective behind upcoming trips from Gulf officials to Washington over the coming months, and really leading up to the end of the year, will have a heavy emphasis on trying to push forward, the licensing approval needed for chip exports to essentially allow the big deals that were announced back in May and that developments have continued to happen on in especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE to move forward, whether it's Saudi's Humane and the work they're doing with that new tech company or the UAE's tech AI tech campus. So I think my sense is that will be a big focus for Gulf officials, and they're not going to be very interested in pursuing other forms of cooperation that could make those negotiations and deals with the Americans more difficult. At this point, let me just make a pitch to the audience. Go ahead and send any questions you may have in, and we'll do our best to get to them before we wrap up on the hour. We're more than halfway through our conversation. Jonathan, if you were to think kind of looking ahead, more forward looking, think about the 1+2+3 cooperation framework in a more forward looking analysis. What might you expect to see in terms of changes to this type of cooperation pattern, cooperation framework moving forward? I mean, you mentioned a couple of dimensions you'd like to include in that are maybe not formally part of it, but we could think about as falling broadly into this category. But what are the changes you may expect to see? What other sectors or industries or activities do you think are going to fall into those broad buckets? Or potentially could constitute, over the coming years, a 1+2+3+4.
Yeah. Well, I'm not interested in a four. This book took way longer than I was expecting it to. But I mean, like I said a few minutes ago, if I would expect EVs, to be a really big focus. If there were to be a reboot. This is really interesting. I mean, I was in class today talking with my Emirati students, and I just asked them, 5 years ago, had you ever seen a Chinese car driving through Abu Dhabi or Dubai? And they're like, no. But you literally cannot, like, it seems like every third car you see on the highway now is a Chinese EV, and they've come in such a huge way, and that you see across the Arab world. And this kind of also brushes into that kind of vulnerability sensitivity issue, because more vulnerability sensitivity for auto exporting countries. This is totally a supply and demand issue. The Chinese manufacturers just built way too much, for their own domestic consumption. Now they're flooding foreign markets. It was weird for me to go home to Canada this summer and not see a single Chinese car for the whatever it was, 7 weeks I was there. Because our auto industry wouldn't stand for, these things that are coming in, with ridiculous prices that don't make any sense. Because they're just flooding markets here, but they're incredibly attractive. I was talking to a very well-off Arab friend recently who said, he's considering trading in his Range Rover for a high-end Chinese EV. And he thought, well, I'm not losing anything in the comfort. I'm not losing anything in the, attractiveness of it. I'm just saving a bunch of money. And so you're seeing this a lot. So I think that's the thing. And you see that right across, like, whether it's wealthy countries, whether it's less wealthy countries, despite all of the tension, political tension in the Israel-China relationship since October 7th, 23, Chinese EV sales have just exploded in Israel over the past 2 years. to the point where I saw something. It was in Xinhua, so take it with a grain of salt. But that something like 67% of new EV sales in Israel last year were from Chinese manufacturers. So that to me is the one I would be watching for if I were to do a follow up.
That's really interesting. Let me let me go to some of the questions now that are coming in to make sure we get through as many as we can. Um, First, given the discussion of trade imbalances, which we talked about earlier on in the conversation, how much are Gulf actors and China concerned about these? I mean, or thinking about the ensuing vulnerabilities or leverages, both given domestic needs and in the context of concerns of strategic competition?
So I think looking at vulnerabilities in trade, I mean, what you see is if they manage to achieve what they're trying to achieve in developing these post-hydrocarbon economies and developing new industries and new opportunities for growth, then that will be addressed naturally, right? That they're going to have, their own um, industries, manufacturing, whatever that's going to help them offset that. Um, I heard an interesting point in one Gulf country last year where we were talking about um, these economic vulnerabilities. And the person I was speaking with was a retired, very high-ranking official in a GCC country, not the UAE, by the way. Um, when we were talking about this, he said, "Look, we're not at all worried about, this vulnerability with China. It doesn't affect us. But what happens is you'll see less well-endowed Arab countries that do get very deeply engaged because there's no other country that's willing to do so much at the same level as China does. And those countries, it creates a very deep asymmetry that is going to be very hard for them to navigate. And this retired official's take was, this is how it affects us, is we're going to have to come in and either mediate or bail out our neighbors who have done way too much with a country that they don't understand very well. So, I thought it was an interesting take on the vulnerabilities. Here in the Gulf, you don't see it so much. And when it does start to happen, like think Oman in 2017, when that was just every story you saw was something about Chinese companies were going into Duqm and they're going to put $11 billion in and they're going to do all this stuff. And you could see a moment where the Omani government seemed to go, whoa, we are really leveraged here. China's like by far our biggest export market, by far our biggest trading partner. And we're not really comfortable with the kind of leverage that this gives them over our economy. And they really seem to put their foot on the brake. So, here in the Gulf, you see that there's maybe a bit of self-correcting that can be sorted out. But I think the bigger concern is in countries that don't have the economic wherewithal, maybe they won't have that opportunity.
Yeah. And a word that comes up throughout your book is uneven. I think it's a kind of useful counterpoint to the cooperation pattern that you use, which I think is quite consistent. It's neat, it's tidy, it can apply very well to a number of countries. But when you apply that cooperation um, uh, pattern, you do see there are uneven manifestations of Chinese influence across and within different countries. So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind. You really do have to look at these relationships on a country to country basis, and even in some cases, look at different sectors to see that unevenness play out.
Well, I think part of that is just that a lot of these, I mean this kind of an academic term, they're still kind of not very fully formed, mature relationships, right? So they're still in the process of developing the mechanisms to make this a little more balanced. It's not like they've been trading with each other and cooperating with each other for multiple decades. I think they're still trying to find the sweet spot. And if I'm being generous, I think that both sides would look at it as an opportunity to you know do some economic good for themselves if they try to get this relationship right.
Okay. We've got another question for you that may be a tough one, and if you have the answer for this, then you probably can sell it to a number of governments in the region that I think are trying to work on this issue at this very moment. From China's perspective, what could or would they be interested in buying from the region in the next decade that's not energy? So what are those spaces, those industries, those commodities that you think may have some traction in when we're thinking about trade flows moving in the direction from the Gulf to China and not the other way around, beyond oil?
This seems like a ministry official is looking for some free consulting out of me. That's what this question is. Honestly, I mean, to be serious, what would they be interested in buying from the region? Um, that is the billion dirham question because I don't really see what it is. China came in here because of the energy. They came for the energy, they stayed for the contracting. Um, I don't really know what the Gulf countries have to offer beyond that at this point, other than the geography, the influence, their participation in different international forums. The capital, I guess, is the big thing, right? Not what they want to buy from the region, but what they want to get from the region. You see a pretty interesting dynamic, excuse me, post zero COVID, where a lot of representatives for Chinese companies have been coming into the region looking for partnerships with Gulf Capital, thinking, it's one of the things I think that doesn't really get talked about enough is just the dire state of the Chinese economy right now. And what we've gotten used to is this kind of Chinese largesse coming to the Arab world and building stuff. And what's happening now is Chinese companies are coming to Gulf Arab countries and saying, how would you like to invest in us? Right? Um, it's pretty important, I think, to China right now because they are pretty um, needful of FDI coming from different parts of the world, and this is a place where they think would be a natural partner. The problem is, I think that it doesn't really seem to be a perfect fit right now. I mean, you see the Saudis, for example, are doing the same thing. They're looking for FDI. They're looking for foreign investment into their country at the exact moment China wants the same thing. So, the Saudi's Minister of Investment was in China 2 weeks ago, Khalid Al Fallah leading a delegation. And typically, if there was a delegation like that pre-COVID, the newspapers would be full of stories of $40 billion MOUs and $27 billion deals. This time it was very modest, and I think what they're trying to do is both sides are looking for the same types of things. So, I mean, I think that's the story right now is China's looking for Gulf money to help them out, and Gulf countries, to my thinking, are a little reluctant.
And they're not the Chinese are not the only ones too, right? I mean, there are a lot of other kind of global investors who are, I mean, the first place they're going to is the Gulf when they're looking to fundraise, I mean, to raise capital. They're going to the capital of capital, and a lot of other investors and asset managers see a lot of value there. So the Chinese, even if they're able to make a competitive pitch, they're going to have they're going to have to get in line with others too who are looking to do the same thing.
Yeah, a lot of smooth talking guys you know, coming into Abu Dhabi these days.
Okay, let's move on to the next question here. Uh, what is the status of the U.S. Chinese competition for Arab demands of civil nuclear cooperations? What factors play into increasing and decreasing cooperation? We did cover this a little bit in the beginning, but maybe you could elaborate a bit more on the civil nuclear cooperation.
Yeah, so I mean, what you see in the Gulf countries has mostly been cooperation in terms of, you know, scientific, technological cooperation, not so much in like, you know, um, developing their civil nuclear programs or building reactors or anything like this. It's mostly, our scientists talking with your scientists about, you know, best practices in developing a civil nuclear program. There was this expectation, right? When the UAE announced that they're expanding the Baraka plant, there was this thought that, this could be a space maybe where, Chinese nuclear companies might try to get in on the ground floor as well. I just don't see that happening. I mean, I don't have any inside knowledge about this by any stretch, but a big part of Korea's successful bid to build the first reactor was their political alliance with the US made it very feasible and easy for the countries to navigate this. Um, that wouldn't be the case with China. that anything this sensitive would certainly create some strain with the U.S. relationship that I think the GCC countries wouldn't be willing to accept. And I think the same thing with the Saudis, and you don't see the other GCC countries really considering developing civil nuclear energy. There was talk of Kuwait and Oman, but the Fukushima disaster, I think, put that on the back burner. And the same with Jordan was looking into it, and they pulled away. Really, the only Arab countries that talk about it much are Saudi, UAE, Algeria, and Egypt. And Egypt is working with Russia. Algeria might be the place. You've seen some cooperation with Algeria in recent months. I think they built a research center in Algeria, but you don't see much else. So I think really the political tensions is the biggest factor in decreasing the opportunities for cooperation there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. We've got another question that gets back to this idea of competing interests between between Chinese interests and Gulf interests, especially on the export front, localization. But I guess maybe I'll just ask the second part of the question that is new. Do you see a lot of evidence, especially in the Saudi case, of indigenization or real and genuine technology transfer? And I think the context of this question is that is precisely these developing tensions between Chinese interests in expanding their exports to the region, generating overseas revenues, but the Saudi interest in localizing production, which we know is a genuine interest, but it's going to be a tough one to pull off. So, are you seeing any evidence of these, kind of resolution to these competing interests?
Well, I mean, so just more broadly, um, that concern has been kind of at the forefront of this China GCC free trade agreement that just can't seem to get past the finish line. It's been ongoing since 2004, and at different points, China was the one dragging its feet, and then the GCC is dragging its feet, and all the evidence right now seems to be it's the Saudis. Because the Saudis are trying to develop this indigenous manufacturing capacity in line with Saudi Vision 2030. And obviously, their concern is how do you compete with China in this capacity? And if you sign an FTA with China, they're probably going to, create some problems with your own market or your own capacity to do it. Now, in terms of tech transfers, I mean, Rob, you could answer this better than me because you focus on tech more than I do. But I don't see it, but I don't really look for it because I'm kind of more busy on the geopolitical side these days. I don't know. Have you seen much in terms of tech transfer from China to Saudi?
Not as much in the Gulf, but to get back to a point you mentioned about interesting manifestations of Chinese technology cooperation in North Africa, we do see various examples of technology transfer, I think, being more robust in other North African countries. So I
Yeah.
think this is this is an example where that there's more of a space for that to happen in North Africa at the moment, and I think that it's playing out.
Yeah, I'd agree. Again, Morocco, Egypt, this is a real thing there. I don't
Mhm.
see it here the same way, but I'm not really looking.
Yeah. Uh, all right. I think we may have time for one more question here. Uh, and I want to give you the chance to maybe expand the conversation a bit beyond the 1+2+3 and economic cooperation between China and the Gulf. You're looking at a lot of different issues. So what else are you following? Other issues or trends are you following at the moment that you think are really worth our audience keeping an eye on and will be relevant for helping us understand these, these important, multifaceted, but also really complex relations between China and Gulf states.
Oh man, there's so much. I mean, we need another webinar to get into this, but I mean, the EV story is something I've been thinking a lot about these days, and I'm actually working on a report with some friends. Um, Hopefully, will be out this fall. And what we're looking at is just how China's, like I said, has really been flooding a lot of Arab markets with these. But I think the more interesting part of it is manufacturing. So You could see in Egypt, there's been a lot of investment into this, and in Morocco. And also, to a lesser degree, there's been talk of doing stuff in Turkey. And what you see is, the Morocco side to me is super interesting because, of course, the European Union has really locked down, keeping Chinese EVs out of their market, but they have an FTA with Morocco. And suddenly, what you're seeing is all this production is taking place in Morocco, whether it's for components, whether it's especially for battery EV development, and they don't try to hide it. It's like this is for the broader EU market, the much bigger market. So I think what they're doing is looking at these strategic um, points in the Middle East that will help them, not just within, engage the local market, which is important, obviously. But if you can get into Morocco and access Europe, if you can go into Egypt and access the sub-Saharan Africa as well, you can see just kind of workarounds for problems that China's had in doing this. So that's the thing I'm working on right now. I'm also doing a project looking at this CRINC um, grouping, the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Of course, China, Iran is something I've been thinking about for years, and how that kind of fits into a bigger geopolitical construct has been interesting. It's interesting in a terrifying way because I've been working on this since, I guess, December, and events in Iran keep making it look like maybe this project won't be necessary, at least at that angle, much longer, depending on how things play out there. But it's been really interesting to see how they amplify each other's messages and try to support each other, watching the Iranian defense and foreign ministers going to China in the lead up to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. And then President Pezeshkian going to the Tianjin last month, or yeah, I guess technically last month, a couple of weeks ago, to meet with all these other world leaders. China does lend Iran quite a pretty big megaphone. What they do with it is a different matter, but you can see that relationship continues to be a pretty interesting one. So I guess those are the two things I'm thinking about the most right now.
Well, let me add one last thing that I actually took from your Substack newsletter about Chinese and Gulf investors piling into Egypt's Suez Canal economic zone. That's an interesting story to watch too. And it's happening precisely at a time when the Egyptian government is really suffering because of declined revenues because of tensions in the Red Sea and a loss of revenues of maritime traffic through the Suez Canal. So we are seeing, while that's happening, continues to happen and imposing significant economic constraints, we are actually seeing some other ways that do fit very much into this 1+2+3 cooperation framework actually coming to the fore, and if not, replacing those lost revenues, at least moving the needle in a slightly more positive direction. So that's another interesting space to watch. I know I'll give you the credit for it because I kind of came across it through your newsletter. But
No, you're right. I should have mentioned it. Good save there, because the Egypt story is fascinating and it's really important. And there's not a lot of other great powers that are coming in with deep pockets into Egypt right now, and that just creates a lot of opportunities for China. And
and the
I
Gulf
think
countries.
and the Gulf countries too. Um, yeah, so it's a really interesting geopolitical and geoeconomic issue as well.
Great. Oh, look, we're out of time. That hour went by very quickly. Thank you so much for joining, Jonathan. Thank you for publishing this book. You can buy it online or read it online at a depository near you. Hopefully a library. Get a copy for your house and your home library. And otherwise, any last words, Jonathan?
Just first, thanks for buying the book. I know we've got one copy out there now. That's good. But also, more importantly, thanks for this chance to engage with you and your team and your audience. I always enjoy the chance to do stuff with the Gulf States Institute because you guys just put on great events and you get just a great network. So I always enjoy working with you guys.
All right, great. We'll make sure to bring you back soon. So thanks
That'd
again,
be
and
awesome.
thanks for everybody who tuned in, and we'll see everyone later.